Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into this really thought-provoking article. It's called The End of Woke. And I don't know about you, but I'm ready to, explore some of these potentially unsettling possibilities about how cultural movements change and evolve. So,
Absolutely, yeah. It's a provocative piece, that's for sure. And I think that alone makes it worth examining, even if we don't necessarily end up agreeing with everything it says.
yeah, I'm with you on that. Okay, so the article jumps right in, starts with this idea that we're seeing like a decline in those outward expressions of woke ideology.
hmm
And just so we're all on the same page here, by woke, the author is referring to, this heightened awareness of social justice issues, particularly around things like race, gender, and LGBTQ rights.
Yeah, it's often used as a bit of a shorthand to describe like a more progressive worldview, one that emphasizes things like systemic inequality and the need for social change and justice.
Right, right. Okay, so to kind of illustrate this decline, they point to things like corporations toning down their pride campaigns, this past June. And they even go so far as to call it a victory, right? A victory for those who pushed back against these companies and these public displays. So I'm curious to get your take on this. First of all, do you agree? Is this really a victory, or is that an oversimplification?
Well, I think framing it as this clear-cut victory, is a bit simplistic, I have to say. I mean, yeah, there's definitely been pushback against some of these, more progressive ideals, that's for sure. But to say that this signals the end of something as complex as like societal values, that just seems like a really, an oversimplification to me.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's not like you can just like flip a switch and suddenly everyone's, on the same page about these really complex issues.
Exactly. I mean, these things take time and they're constantly evolving, right? So the real question, I think, is why are we seeing this shift? Like, is this an actual, genuine change in people's hearts and minds? Or is it something more, more calculated, more strategic?
Okay, so that is where it gets really, really interesting because the author actually suggests that this might be, a very deliberate, calculated move.
Hmm.
They argue that, minimizing these really public displays of, say, LGBTQ advocacy might actually serve a totally different purpose.
Right. And this is where, we kind of have to like really dive into the author's reasoning here. They suggest that by making these ideas less visible, by toning down those outward displays, by making it less, in your face, they might actually become more pervasive in the long run. And they actually use this analogy, which I have to say is a bit loaded. They call it a contaminant.
A contaminant. Okay, so now that's a little scary. What do they mean by that?
Yeah, so essentially what they're implying is that these ideas are kind of like subtly spreading throughout society, almost like a hidden force, and that's what they find concerning. Um, they're arguing that this more subtle approach, right, this kind of like under the radar approach, might actually be more effective at changing those deep-seated societal norms than just like, more overt activism would be. And whether or not you agree with that, it's a fascinating, argument to consider, I think.
It's like they're saying, "Oh, you think you shut us down and you think the conversation's over. No, 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 we'll be back." It's like that horror movie trope where you think the monster's dead and then.
Exactly. Yeah, like it's just lurking beneath the surface. And this is where the author connects this idea to, this whole debate around transgender rights, for example. They suggest that openly pushing for those rights right now might be too much too fast for some segments of society and could even backfire, on the LGBTQ community as a whole.
So they're saying it's better to kind of play the long game.
In a way, yeah. Now, it's important to remember here that the author is coming from like a more conservative viewpoint, right? So they seem to view this potential backlash with a mix of like caution and dare I say like hope. It's like they think that this pushback might actually unravel some of those progressive victories that they don't agree with.
Interesting. So they see all these all these social justice issues as being kind of interconnected. Like if one domino falls.
Exactly. Gains in one area can kind of like embolden movements in others. And I think it highlights just how interconnected a lot of these issues of social progress can be.
Okay, so now listeners, hold on to your hats because this is where the article takes a little bit of a turn. They then suggest that Western governments, like the big ones, might be intentionally downplaying wokeness to try to unify their populations for something way bigger.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point they make, right? Like they're suggesting that maybe what we're seeing isn't so much about, abandoning these progressive values altogether, but more about a shift in priorities, right? Like maybe governments are starting to feel like they need to prioritize unity over, what they see as these potentially divisive social issues.
Okay, so now we're getting into like conspiracy theory territory, right? What is this, something bigger they keep hinting at? Are we talking like aliens, the return of, I don't know, disco? What are we talking about here?
Yeah, not quite that exciting, I'm afraid. No, they point to things that are happening in the world right now, right? Like think about the ongoing situation in Ukraine, for example, or those growing tensions with China, right? They're suggesting that these kinds of potential conflicts could be pushing governments to think more strategically, to say, okay, we need to present a unified front here. And maybe that means, putting some of those more divisive social issues on the back burner, at least for now.
So basically what they're arguing is that in times of crisis, governments are more likely to kind of, you know, put social progress on hold in the name of national security or, national unity, something like that.
Precisely. And they make this really, I don't know, I guess provocative is the word. They make this really provocative claim where they say that, and I'm quoting here, a battalion of transgender individuals would be ineffective in a war, which I have to say reveals a pretty clear bias in their argument.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty dehumanizing when you think about it, right? To, like, reduce an entire group of people down to their perceived military usefulness. Not really a fair comparison.
Exactly. And I think it's a good reminder, as we're trying to analyze this article, objectively, that we can't ignore the fact that it's coming from a particular perspective, right?
Yeah.
And that perspective inevitably shapes the arguments that are being made.
Right, for sure. For sure. Okay, so back to this something bigger idea. I mean, are they suggesting that there's like an actual trade-off happening here? Like, are governments saying, hey, look, we'll cool it on all the woke stuff, but only if you, the public, are willing to sign up for, I don't know, mandatory military service or, like, what are we talking about here?
Well, the author doesn't, explicitly state that there's this kind of like quid pro quo happening, this direct exchange, but they do kind of hint at it, right? Like they suggest that there might be this kind of, unspoken agreement taking shape where governments are like hoping that if they tone down the rhetoric on social issues, they can, secure the public support for something, well, more significant down the line.
Okay, so maybe not mandatory military service, but definitely something along those lines. It really makes you think, about what we as individuals, what you as a listener might be willing to get up, right, in the name of security or, the so-called national interest. Like, is there a line you wouldn't cross, even for the greater good? It's something to think about, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's one of those questions that doesn't have an easy answer. I mean, history is full of examples of governments, curtailing individual liberties during times of war or crisis. And oftentimes they do it with the support of the very people whose rights are being restricted, which is, a kind of complex and uncomfortable truth about, I guess, about human nature when you think about it.
And to be fair to the author here, they're not necessarily presenting this potential trade-off as like a good thing.
Right.
Like they seem genuinely concerned about it, even if they are also, kind of celebrating the perceived decline of wokeness. It's almost like they're saying, be careful what you wish for,
Right. Like it's this weird mix of like, yes, we won, but at what cost? And I think that speaks to this kind of, underlying anxiety that a lot of people are feeling these days, regardless of, where they fall on the political spectrum. Like the world is changing so rapidly, and it's not always clear, what those changes mean, where we're headed, and that uncertainty can be, pretty unsettling.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about this potential victory over, quote unquote wokeness. But it sounds like the author's also suggesting that maybe this like toned down approach is actually more, I don't know, insidious in a way. Like it's not really about progress, but about subtly getting people used to these ideas without them even realizing it,
Yeah, it's like that classic line from, The Usual Suspects, right? The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So like by making it less visible, it actually becomes more powerful in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And they use that term contaminant to really drive that point home, right? Like the implication is that these ideas are somehow dangerous or insidious, seeping into society unnoticed. It's definitely a way of framing progressive values as like a threat, which, as we've discussed, plays into a lot of those existing anxieties and fears that are already out there.
It's like that old saying, right? The frog in the boiling water. The temperature rises slowly enough. The frog won't even realize it's in danger until it's too late.
Such a good analogy. That's exactly what the author's getting at, right? They're suggesting that this kind of like gradual, almost imperceptible shift in social norms, it can be just as effective, if not more so, than a more, overt or confrontational approach.
Yeah, and from a purely strategic standpoint, I mean, it's hard to argue with that, right? I mean, think about how advertising works, for example. Like, we're constantly being bombarded with all these subtle messages, these images, this music, and it shapes our desires and our beliefs without us even, like, consciously realizing it. So could the same be true for, for social change?
It's definitely a possibility worth considering, right? And I think it's something that both sides of the political spectrum engage in, whether they're doing it consciously or not. I mean, the author is particularly concerned about this happening, from the left, but you could easily flip that around and argue that, the same tactics are being used by the right as well.
Touche. Okay, so it sounds like it's not so much about like who's doing it, but rather like the methods being used and the potential consequences of those methods. So, wow, we've covered a lot of ground here today. We started with this idea of, the end of woke, this potential decline. And then we got into like, the possibility that it might just be going underground, becoming more subtle. And then, of course, there's this whole idea that maybe, just maybe, this is all part of some bigger plan, some grand strategy by, those in power, those corporations, those governments. It's a lot to unpack. So I guess my question is, where does this leave us? Like, what's the takeaway for our listeners, those folks at home who, like me, are still trying to, wrap their heads around all of this?
Right. Well, I think at the end of the day, this article, whether you buy into all of his arguments or not, it really highlights something important. And that's that social and political landscapes, they're not static, right? They're constantly changing, constantly evolving. And what we see on the surface, what's trending on Twitter, what the politicians are saying, that might not be telling us the whole story, right? There might be something else going on beneath the surface.
It's like that old saying, there are no permanent victories in politics. Just when you think you've got it all figured out, the game changes.
100%. And this article, it really throws down the gauntlet, I think. It challenges us to consider not just the potential decline of this very like overt wokeness, but also, like you said, this possibility of a much larger, perhaps unseen agenda that's at play here.
It really makes you wonder, what would that agenda look like? I mean, if this is all like some calculated strategy, what are those in power hoping to gain? And, more importantly, what are they willing to give us or maybe even take from us in pursuit of this, this supposed greater good? I don't know. It's definitely given me a lot to think about.
Me too. And I think, honestly, that's the mark of a truly thought-provoking piece, right? Regardless of where you stand on these issues, it makes you question your assumptions, it makes you consider other perspectives, and, ultimately it forces you to like really engage with the complexity of the world around us, which is, what we're all about here on The Deep Dive.
Oh. Absolutely. Well said. A huge thank you to you for diving into this with me today. It's been a really fascinating conversation. And to our listeners out there, thank you, as always, for tuning in. Remember to keep those questions coming, keep those minds curious. We'll be back next time with another deep dive into, who knows what thought-provoking topic we'll tackle next. Until then, happy diving, everyone.